Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I am your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today, we're going to be discussing the anti-France sentiments that have swept former French colonies in Africa, and particularly looking at the position taken by Senegal. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest and friend, Professor Marc-Antoine, Perouse de Monclos. Marc-Antoine is a senior researcher at the Institut de Recherche, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this well, Early Development. Pardon my...
Actually, it's the Research Institute for Development. We say the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement.
Oh, this is the Institute for Development. And he's also the scientific director of the Nigerian Watch Project, which is a database, an important database that collects data on conflicts, several conflicts in Nigeria. And Marc-Antoine has written over 80 articles and books, and he's a leading voice in conflict and conflict issues and conflict in Africa. Marc-Antoine, I'm very delighted to finally have you join me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. I'm also very pleased to talk to you again.
Brilliant. So in recent years, I don't know how recent it's, well, at least in the last decade, we've seen witnessed a surge in anti-French sentiments on the continent, especially in former French colonies. What is the driving force behind this kind of like force or movement?
I think there are different issues at stake. One is to do with the way with the specificities of the decolonization of French-speaking Africa, which was different from the indirect rule in British West Africa, and the presence of France politically, militarily, and sometimes even economically was heavier, let's say it this way. But France, as the influence of France in French-speaking Africa has been running for the since independence. There are several indicators showing that the number of French people living in Africa is reducing. The number of French military posted south of the Sahara is going down. The share of the African markets by France are also reducing a lot, giving more room to competitors like China, Turkey, even Indonesia, So this is a long trend, but recently it has become very visible because of the series of coups in the Sahel that were clearly going against the interest of France, especially when it comes to the French military intervention in Barkhane, and also recently the results of the elections in Senegal, with the candidate who was seen as anti-French, but it's maybe not as anti-French as it seems, but clearly he was also elected on an agenda, a political agenda, which pays a lot of attention to African sovereignty. And now the best way to lose elections in French-speaking Africa today is to seem to be supported by Paris. Then you are very sure, because there were other precedents like in the Republic of Benin or even in the Central African Republic, where some of the candidates for elections were seen as being supported, rightly or wrongly, maybe it was wrong assumptions, but anyway, from the very moment they were seen as being supported by Paris, then they lost the elections. So there's clearly this demand is still there very much of a grievance, of a revendication of sovereignty, which sometimes take an anti-French dimension.
It's very interesting. Very, very interesting statement that a lot of people with critical insight have been saying that even though French, whilst they admit that even though French policies, like you rightly pointed out, is quite different from the United Kingdom or Britain indirect rule, where you could see more visible, even though that in itself it's but a lot of people have been saying that the elites in these African countries have been exploiting these French narratives to their, and you've mentioned that as well. But I wanted to take you up on that. So one of the things, I had a speaker last time come talk about Chad, and we've seen that one of the things that the Senegalese young president has said is French have been inconsistent, and he particularly mentioned Mali and Chad, whereas in Chad, Debbie's not activity is celebrated. But in Mali, when Mali entire government manipulated the transition program, Mali French stood against it. So I guess my question is there a point where we can say French policies can also, is there valid or legitimate grievance against French inconsistency in the continent?
Well, Chad is a very special case, I would say. Unlike Mali or Burkina Faso, where more on the eastern side, during the Cold War, Chad was always very close to France, and Chad has been like a playing ground for the French army since independence. There were so many military interventions, unlike other West African French-speaking countries. So Chad is very specific, and indeed, many political leaders in Chad have been seen as being in power because they were supported by France and falling because they were no longer supported by France. And the war on terror with the G5 Sahel, against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Mali and Burkina Faso, was a way to rehabilitate the regime of Idriss Déby, which is a very authoritarian regime. Déby came by force to power in 1990, and he was really very strongly supported by the French government, militarily and financially also, even if the economic interests of France are not there in Chad, because there is oil, but it's exploited by the Chinese and the Americans, not by the French. So it had more to do with an old relationship, which dates back actually to the Second World War, because Chad played a major role during the Second World War. There was a famous military division, in French one, called the Deuxième DB, Deuxième Division Blindée, which was posted in Chad, and that helped to go with the British and the Americans against the Germans, against the Nazis, to liberate France in 1945. And these troops were coming from Chad. So there was also this sentimental relationship with Chad, between the French military and Chad. There's a kind of love story, kind of. And so it's very specific. And indeed, in the case of Chad, the relationship has always been very close. It might be changing now. It might be changing because on the long run, there's been some change in the way France intervened militarily in Africa, in its former colonies. At independence up to the 1970s, 80s, it was bilateral military intervention. Intervening in Gabon to restore a government, or intervening in Central Africa to topple a dictatorship like Amin Dada and so forth. It was bilateral. Then there was a break in this kind of operation, which dates back to the failure of the military intervention in Rwanda during the genocide. It was a total disaster because the French army actually supported a genocidal government, and it was really very painful for the French army to be under a French government that would ask them to support actually people perpetrating a genocide. And it's still a big, we have just been celebrating, the anniversary of the Rwandese genocide, and it's still a big issue in France. And from then on, there was a change in the way French military intervention were organized, even in Chad, because they became much more multilateral. Like the one with the G5 Sahel, the Operation Serval and then Barkhane in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mauritania, and Chad, were organized together with the UN, which had some blue helmets in Mali, and also with African armies. So it was not just France alone in an African country. It was much more multilateral, and that helped to consolidate the military presence of France in Chad, which was included in the Operation Barkhane, even if Chad was not really affected by the jihadi group that were striking in Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger. But yet Chad was included in the mandate of the Operation Barkhane because the main military presence of France in this region is in Jamena. That's where the barracks are. That's where the command is. So for convenient reasons, for logistical reasons, the Chad was included into this Operation Barkhane. But this war on terror was also a way for the regime of Idriss Déby to get some support, because Déby was seen as an authoritarian regime. He was not well accepted in the international community. And that's why you see how the war on terror became a vent or a kind of way to get some foreign support financially and militarily, because Chad became a key asset in the war on terror. And nobody would ever then criticize the human rights violations in Chad, as long as Chad would do the job to help the French army with fighting Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And that's how this relationship between France and the authoritarian regime in Chad. Today it's the son of Idriss Déby who is in power and is going to be elected very soon. We all know that. And this relationship evolved, changed, but it's still the same relationship, except that it's more multilateral in the framework of a global war on terror, So it's not any longer the one-by-one relation, it's more multilateral, but at the end it's still the same, in the sense that you have a French military, they have a mandate, and they are seen as being supportive of authoritarian regime, which is very much the case in Chad today.
It's quite interesting you say that, because we've seen within the framework of the war on terror. So we see let's go to Uganda, for instance, and we've seen where the US has supported Uganda, which is clearly an authoritarian government, but within that framework, like, is helping to fight, terrorists. That is good. So we're seeing that kind of relationship, like you've rightly mentioned, and then again but then you've mentioned all these several operations. I'm just going to move forward and come back a bit. Operation Serval, Operation Barkhane, we have the G5 Sahel, and definitely I know Chad has been playing a lot of critical role in the Lake Chad. Chad was very, very instrumental in the fight against Boko Haram and all of that. But one of the things that the populist drive has have done is that despite all of this campaign, it hasn't been able to stop this Al-Qaeda or jihadist movement from moving. So I guess my question is, we know that the war on terror has all these other partners. Why does France receive much of the attention? We've recently seen, definitely in Niger, where the Niger junta government has terminated its agreement with the US. But before then, it looked like the US was safe. It looked like we don't have a problem with you. We only have a problem with France. So why is that? So even the UK, all these other partners have stake in all of this fight in the Sahel. But why is France singled out?
Well, in the case of Niger, finally the Americans, the military, were also evicted by the military junta, not only France. It took a later stage, but anyway, the results were the same. Why? Because it's former French colonies, so there was always this relationship Unlike in other countries, like you mentioned, Uganda, which is a former British colony, but the relationship has been built mainly when it comes to the war on terror with the Americans, which also played this role. Like it's one of the unintended consequences of the war on terror. The result is that you support authoritarian and corrupt regimes, which is exactly what Operation Barkhane did in the Sahel, including Chad. And that's why also there are these grievances whereby, in the name of the war on terror, you support corrupt regimes that are not popular. And that also explains the grievance against France, which is seen as actually supporting this regime. And in the case of Chad, again, there are some specificities because the mandate of the Operation Barkhane was really to fight on terror groups, and their names, they were listed, they were blacklisted: Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the Islamic State in the Sahel, and so forth. Ansarul Islam, and so forth. But in the name of this war on terror, I think it was in 2020 or 2019, the French Air Force struck on two rebel groups coming from the border of Libya. And they were not jihadi groups, they were not Islamist armed groups, they were armed opponents against the regime of Idriss Déby. And these groups were clearly not in the mandate of Operation Barkhane. So the fact that the French army struck against these groups shows very much that in the name of the war on terror, at the end, you are there as protecting corrupt and authoritarian regimes. On the Chad is as clear as with the Americans in Uganda. Museveni came to power in 1986, even 4 years before Idriss Déby, and clearly it's not democratic either. And all these military interventions do not solve issues of governance, when it comes to embezzlement, when it comes to human rights violations. Quite on the contrary, they tend to exacerbate that, because the more money there is, thanks to international aid, the more corruption there is, and the more supportive you are of these regimes, then they can perpetrate human rights violations without any criticism, because the objective is indeed to fight terror groups. And at the same time, you legitimate jihadi groups that are seen as not democratic, of course, but at least resisting force, armed resistance against oppressive governments supported by foreign forces, which are former colonial powers. So at the end, a bit like with the Shebab in Somalia against Ethiopia, which is supported by the US. So at the end, Al-Qaeda can also, in northern Mali, for instance, present itself as being a jihadi group protecting the good Muslims against foreign invaders who are Christians and who are former colonial powers. And that's also the unintended effect of this war on terror. And Operation Barkhane was a synthesis of all these unintended effects. And to no level the end, because meanwhile, the jihadi groups continued to expand towards the south. Separatist Tuareg groups are still there in northern Mali. So again, all these military interventions solved nothing, but they actually exacerbated some of the evils that affect Africans today in this region of the world. So that was quite the challenge.
So what I take from that is to be honest, the military intervention failed, and that in itself, there's some kind of legitimacy in the rise of popular angst against, the foreign forces, which in some former colonies, French colonies, the military has capitalized on. So we see in Burkina Faso, in Mali, Niger, they've capitalized on that popular narrative to either seize power or to entrench power in there. So before I come to the question I was going to ask, how does that affect these operations against jihadists? Now that the foreign forces are withdrawn in Mali, the United Nations mission has been withdrawn in Niger, the French has withdrawn. How does that affect the G5 Sahel, all these operations against jihadists? What does it portend for security in these regions in the Sahel?
Actually, the G5 Sahel was, never really worked properly. So now there is a Sahel Alliance, which is grouping the three military regimes in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. When it comes to their fighting against jihadi group, it's not performing better than when the French were there. But the jihadi groups are not progressing toward capital cities, but they are entrenching into rural areas where they were active before. And because these military national armies, are mainly busy with keeping power, they're more busy in fighting themselves within the capital city to put a hand on the prevalence of the state, while the jihadi groups are controlling some rural areas, and they consolidated their assets in these distant, remote rural areas. But there was not as big a change as one could imagine. And interestingly enough, there was in 2021 an analysis by the RAND Corporation, which is a kind of CIA think tank in the USA. In 2021, when nobody was talking or even thinking about the end of Barkhane operation, and these experts were concluding that if the French army left Sahel, it wouldn't change much. And you wouldn't have a failure of the states in the region, which is exactly what's going on now. These states are not falling, but are not improving. And this points to another failure of the French military intervention, and that's a failure we never talk about. We see this failure as being a diplomatic one for France, which is now evicted from the Francophone Sahel, or we see it from a political point of view, on the fact that the French army had to leave Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali. But there's one other failure. The mandate of Operation Serval and Barkhane was also to consolidate the local capacities, local military capacities. And this did not work. This military cooperation, but you could say the same with the British and the Americans elsewhere in Africa, I'm afraid. The military capacities of these national armies did not improve when it comes to fighting counterinsurgency, and fighting jihadi groups that are classified as being terrorists. They are still killing a lot of civilians, and all the human rights violations perpetrated by national armies are actually giving a legitimacy to jihadi groups as protecting good Muslims against miscreants that are no longer supported by France, but are still seen as being miscreants anyway, because they kill a lot of civilians. It creates a sense of revenge, a bit like in Nigeria with the Nigerian army and Boko Haram. And then some youth join these groups, not because they are there to some radical Islamic ideology, but because they fear for their life, and they know that if ever you are a young Muslim, you might be caught arbitrarily, accused of being a terrorist, and be tortured to death in a jail. So they prefer to go and fight. And all these killings of civilians, the stigmatization of the Fulanis in Mali or in Burkina Faso or in Niger, all contribute to actually exacerbate the conflict and prolong the hostilities. And these national armies, they still, and since the French army left, they perpetrate more human rights violations. They kill even more civilians than before. We have enough evidence of that because the Russian militaries, the Russian mercenaries like Wagner or Africa Corps or whatever name you want to give them, are actually paying not any attention on human rights violations. So they also contribute to these killings of civilians. So the grievance against this military regime in rural areas, this is something different in capital cities, but in rural areas where there are all these human rights violations, still contribute to legitimize and actually entrench jihadi groups in this very zone. So it's going to be a conflict on the very long run, even if there are hidden negotiations here and there, very local usually. It's not going to end next year, and the military in power in Ouagadougou or in Niamey or in Bamako never proved that they were more efficient than civilian regime to fight against terror groups. They never proved that. We don't have any evidence. But at the same time, it's true that these states did not fall. It's not Somalia. You still have a government It's corrupt, it doesn't work well, but you still have a civil administration working in Mali or in Niger or in Burkina Faso. It's not the collapse that one could imagine if ever the French army would leave. This did not happen, but again, the situation is very bad in rural areas where the jihadi groups are getting stronger and stronger.
Interesting that you mentioned the Russians and the Russian machinery. So whilst the Western, traditional Western partners like the French and the US have been asked to leave or are withdrawing, we're seeing other superpowers like Russia and even middle powers. We're seeing Iran and other these places, especially from these new Kunta governments reaching out to these people. But again, if we see this bleak security situation in the region, and then it can lead to how much does that threaten regional security or international peace and security? And if it does, within the context of international security, how will the West, how will France, how will US react to it if it threatens international security?
I don't think France and the US can do much in this regard, except sending a lot of troops. And we know what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in France today. There's no way you would consider another big military intervention in the Sahel. No way, absolutely no way. So they will let it go because they don't have much choice anyway. Russia or Iran don't have any economic interest in this region. Unlike France, which had a kind of sentimental relationship, there are big Malian communities in France. Unlike France, there is no historical relationship between Iran or Russia with the Sahel. So they are there to actually disturb the international game. They don't gain much from it from an economical point of view, but it could be of use, for instance, to import some weapons through Burkina Faso and then export it to Russia. It can be, during the Cold War, there was a node alliance kind of between South Africa, the apartheid regime, and Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to circumvent an embargo on weapons altogether, On this can, Russia or Iran could also try to use the Sahel as a way to circumvent sanctions, economic sanctions. So for them, it could be an asset. But when it comes to the natural resources, whether it's oil, which is extracted by Chinese in Niger, or gold, which is extracted by Canadian companies in Mali, the Russians are nowhere to be seen. So it's like France, they don't have a big economic interest there. So it's more a political game, a big game, and a game of influence, It's very convenient and it's very cheap for Russia to disturb the West in the Sahel. It doesn't cost them much, even though they don't gain much economically, but it doesn't cost them much to rebuff the US and France. So it's a way for them to play a big game. But the stakes for them is not so much in the Sahel. They don't have this. During the Cold War, there were some close relationship between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Mali, a bit also with Burkina Faso. But again, the stakes had more to do with international relations, in the global world, not so much the Sahel as such. And I could never imagine that the Russian troops would really get involved in this region. No way. You will still have these mercenaries. They are trying to Africa Corps or Wagner, the Russian mercenaries are making money in Central Africa because they put a hand on some of the gold mines, yes, but not in Mali, where the gold is extracted by the Canadians. So they're not making money in Mali, actually. They are not even really paid. But what we are told, there are many allegations that actually the military junta does not even fill the contract, when they are to pay the Russian mercenaries. And they lost in this regard because the French troops were for free. The Malian government didn't have to pay for it, and it cost $1 billion per year, so it's not negligible, Whereas the mercenaries, you have to pay for them, and apparently they're not paid. So they must find ways to make money out of money, but I don't think it's a big jackpot for them. It's not a golden.
So what's this? What's Burkina Faso, Mali, and all of these places where you have military governments? Why it's quite obvious, and we see the dynamics with Russia and all of that. I think Senegal offers somewhat of contradiction. So in Senegal, it's the democratic government, and it is anti-French stance. May also be. So it's I was listening to the speech by the young president, and when he was saying France should leave us alone, and then in the same speech he was talking about more collaborative, sustainable kind of like partnership. So I'm looking in Senegal, where it's a democracy to some, to a large extent, compared to all of these places where you have military government, where you have all this Russian influence. What can you say to that? Why is he expressing a similar strong anti-French stance? And and it's all gone.
But whether it's civilians or military, the anti-French sentiment is a way to express nationalism. But when it comes to the elections in Senegal, from a democratic point of view, it's very good news. Democracy worked. The opposition won. This is excellent. And okay, maybe there is some anti-French sentiments, but again, there are the rhetorics, and then there is the reality. There are huge Senegalese communities of migrants in France, and I don't believe that the current government in power in Dakar would break diplomatic relations with France. They don't have an interest to that. But they are using the anti-French sentiment they used it to win the elections, clearly. As Macky Sall, the former president, was seen as being supported by France. So they are using this anti-French sentiment, but I don't think they will go that far as breaking relations with France. It's not in their interest. So they will try to reset the relationship with the former colonial master. But you see, well, it's when I give courses on Africa to my students in France, I always tell them, well, look, if you look at Europe, how can you really compare Albania and Germany? And how can we compare Senegal, which is rather developed, and Chad or Nigeria or Botswana or Mauritius? It's very different countries. So we are talking about the Sahel, but we have very different countries in the Sahel. And Senegal is completely different from Chad. There is an intellectual tradition, a democratic tradition, and they proved it recently. I don't see the military taking power in Senegal, no way. Unlike Mali or Niger or of course Chad, where the military were always in power, kind of. So Senegal has also its specificities, and the relation with France is a kind of hate and love and hate relation, because I remember when I was in Senegal, I would talk with some intellectuals in Senegal, and they told me, during the colonization, we Senegalese were the one who colonized other countries in the Sahel for France, on behalf of France, because they were more educated. They were on the coast, the French presence in Senegal from the 16th century, in cities like Saint-Louis or Gorée, and there were 4 cities in Senegal that we call the 4 communes, les 4 communes, and they had elected representatives during the republics in France, the 4th Republic, the 3rd Republic. So from a very long time, the Senegalese had a very specific relation with France, unlike Chadians or Malians or Burkinabe, and they are very proud of this relationship. So it's very ambiguous, because at the same time, they did colonize by proxy the Sahel on behalf of the French imperator, kind of colonization. And many Senegalese consider themselves as being more enlightened than, say, the Bushman from Mali or Niger, so they have also this proudness, of being more educated and more enlightened than other African countries in the region. And I don't think they want to give up this position. They are really attached to it. even when it comes to their international position.
I think I agree with you. But again, there's one thing you mentioned before about France's economic position or economic influence in the region. You did say it. Is that contrary to some? Because some people have said in Niger, for instance, there's the natural resources that France relies on. But in Senegal, let's come back to Senegal, where I think that's where France has its largest embassy or its largest whatever.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the largest embassy, but it has to do with cultural relations, not economic interest. What is Senegal on the market, on the global market? I'm sorry to say so for the Senegalese, but it's nothing. They produce groundnuts. No, it's not a big economic asset for France. It's not a big market. Most of the economic trade of France is with Asia and America, and Africa is marginal. And when it comes to Africa, the main economic assets of France in Africa is in Morocco. This is very important for France because it's a developing country. They are building new automotive factories, and Morocco, the economic is really going well. It's growing up. So there are a lot of French investments in Morocco. And south of the Sahara, the main trading partner is Nigeria because of oil, and South Africa, which also has an industrial base. So and a lot of mining. And these are two former British colonies. And you don't see former French colonies in the top list, of the main trading partners of France south of the Sahara. But many Africans, French-speaking Africans, do not know that. So they believe that country is a key asset for the French economy, and it's not. So they over-evaluate the economic interest of France in these countries. When it comes to Niger, when it comes to Mali and Burkina Faso, forget it. There are no French economic interests. It's negligible, really negligible. And the people there are rather poor, so they are not buying a lot. The imports are even negligible. I mean, globally, the only strategic assets in this region were uranium in Niger. But for the last 30 years, some of the uranium mines in northern Niger, in Arlit, has been closing. The French pulled out, and now the main procurers of uranium, which is absolutely a key strategic resource for the French atomic industry, are coming from Kazakhstan and Canada, no longer Niger. And because of the very bad relationship today with Niger, you can expect that in the coming years, less and less uranium will come from Niger. So even in this country where you had one key strategic asset for France, even there is going down, So I don't think we should overestimate the economic interest of France in this region of the world. Again, the economic figures we have of trade do not confirm this.
So, but if we look at like you mentioned something before about whether the French or the Americans would intervene, in stuff. But I would say in the way the world is very, united in terms of like the threats we face, common threats, global threats, and in the way these security threats are being globalized. It does look like the French cannot be totally removed from whatever situation happens, whether it be in terms of illegal immigration, forced migration, whether it be whatever kind of way. So it's also in the interest of France or in the interest of the West to improve relationship with the. So what is France? Is France doing anything besides the failed military intervention relationship to improve this type of future? And what is it if they're doing that?
No, you're right. The migration issues is very important for Europe, not only for France. And this was never said clearly, but there was hope from European partners that Operation Barkhane would also be a way not only to fight terror groups, and that was not in the mandate, but also to contain immigration. Immigration to Europe from Africa is not Syrians trying to cross Mediterranean. It's Nigerians, Ivorians, people from the Atlantic coast that are trying to cross the Sahel to reach Europe. So they just crossed the Sahel. So the idea was to kind of, securize the borders also to avoid all these migrants coming from littoral countries on the Atlantic coast and trying to cross the Sahel. And this failed. So it's still very much of an issue. And recently Niger suspended, actually they even broke the contract they had with the agreement they had with the European Union when it comes to the regulation of migration. So European aid is also being stopped now in Niger. And the military junta in power is ready to risk this to regain their sovereignty on their borders. And there are also maybe, tensions between Niger and Algeria, because whenever some people are crossing Niger and they are caught in Algeria, then the Algerian army will just dump them in the desert in Niger and off they go. And the Niger government is not very happy at that also, to deal with all these illegal immigrants. But the issue is still very much there. Now, the common interest between France and the US in the western part of Sahel, because the Sahel extends up to Eritrea and Sudan, and we never talk about it, but we're just talking about central and western Sahel. The common interest between France and the US have to do with, contain the Russian influence and fight terror groups. Unlike France and Europe, the US are not really concerned by migration issues in the Sahel. So that's an issue which is not very much at stake for them. So they are more focused on terror groups and indeed the Russian influence. And these are common interest with France, no doubt about it. But not when it comes to migration issues. This is different. This is just for France and European partners. And you could see that also in the fact that in Niger, Germany for some time trying to remain in Niger while France was losing ground and the French embassy was closed and the French ambassador was expelled. The German, at the beginning tried to play it low profile. They still have a few military men in Niger, but they will go very soon, because they were very much concerned by the migration issue. It really also hit very hard Germany. And the idea with Opération Serval and Berkane at the beginning for Germany was indeed to use France also as a way to contain this migration through porous borders. So when France was expelled from Niger, Germany first tried to remain there, but now they realize that it's not possible also. The US are going, the Germans are going, everybody is going, at least from the European side. So we're on the same side, I believe, as France today when it comes to migration challenge in the Sahel, Germany and France, I mean.
Very interesting. I've always said, in my work, I've always said that strategic interest is very, no, everyone has strategic interest. Every country, there's no intervention that is bereft of strategic interest. But again, I've also argued in my office that strategic interest needs to be declared. There needs to be a balance between, pursuing one strategic interest as a foreign policy and also looking at being genuinely invested in the needs of the locals where they've been intervening. So if we're looking at how that delicate balance can be achieved in terms of like, yes, we want this is our interest, we want to mitigate against migration, but how can we, because like you rightly admitted, the military intervention failed. So perhaps, what could have worked is, the teeming youth population could have been, educated. It could be education, it could be economic empowerment, it could be all of this. So moving forward, how do you see that relation? Because I've seen the US policy, I had the US First Secretary, and now there's a language of partnership in the US policy towards Africa. There's that, language of partnership, language of all of that. Moving forward, do you think that's the way forward? Do you think it's all about partnership, it's all about language changing, it's all about, addressing the needs of, I don't know.
Development aid will not be a substitute to military intervention, and while there was the military, the French military intervention, development aid was also very much focused on migration issues, to try to retain people in their country, to try to promote education. Everything was there already. And now, if the diplomatic relations are compromised and if the military intervention is finished, I don't see how you could continue this so-called partnership through development aid. And development aid is going down. On the French side, it has stopped when it comes to Niger. And when it comes to the European Union, it's also going down because the Niger government has broke the agreement when it comes to the regulation of immigration. So I don't really see many ways for Western governments to influence Niger, even through economic sanctions that never worked anyway, to influence Syrian governments to reinforce their struggle against illegal immigration. I don't see the levies, to be frank with you.
This could actually be a good thing if you're looking at how the relationship between the unequal relationship between maybe Africa and the rest of the world can be repaired. That or again, maybe the African population, which is mainly the youth population, can be able to hold their leaders accountable. It could work out that way, but if you're looking at it in terms of the context of African solutions or African solutions, it could be a good thing. But how do you see it? I wanted to conclude by looking at different layers. So look at Africa in the direction and the trajectory which it is going. But then again, I can't help but, like you rightly noticed, that whilst the West is going, all the forces are coming, all the foreign partners are coming. So there's the French, there's the Chinese, there's the Russian, there's Turkey, there's all these middle powers as well. But if you look forward, look like within the African Union, 2063 agenda and all of that stuff. Where do you see Africa going without, all of this support, military support or development aid support from the West? Do you see a bright future, a positive one? Do you see negative? How do you see France and whatever reconnecting back? Is there going to be a point where they're going to reconnect back, and at what level are they going to reconnect? What kind of relationship are they going to have then?
I don't know. Are you talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger, or which country? Because again, it's so
I'm just talking more broadly now. So with the Sahel, I'm talking about the Sahel specifically, and then broadly, if you're looking at it more broadly, just complete more broadly in terms of the continent, continent-wide.
France is not going to reconnect because it's already very well connected with Ivory Coast, for instance. They have a very good relationship. And Ivory Coast, the government needs also a French military support to control the border with Burkina Faso and avoid jihadi groups interfering. It's a bit the same in Togo and the Republic of Benin. And France is still, there was a coup in Gabon, but France is still well connected in Gabon and even in Congo, Brazzaville. So France still has some influence in some former colonies, and a rather good relationship with with the governments in power in this relationship. So again, Africa is very diverse. And if you go beyond Francophone Africa, then France has improved its relationship with Rwanda. It has excellent relationship at the moment with President Tinubu in Nigeria, because France and Nigeria were on the same line against the military junta in Niger. So there are ups and downs, On the long run, what you see globally, if you only to talk about at the scale of the continent, is that since independence, the influence of France in Africa generally has been waning. From an economic point of view, when it comes to the number of troops posted in Africa, or when it comes to the number of French living in Africa, all the indicators are very clear. It's going down, 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 which also means something very important, less and less people pay attention to Africa in the French government. This is very important. Because when you have a French communities living in, say, Madagascar or Senegal or even Algeria before independence, then it means you have some French colonial lobbies, sort of, you know. These lobbies have gone. These lobbies are no longer there. So today, even the President Macron is more concerned about Asia or America. That's where the money is. That's where the trade is. So there have been some, military intervention in Africa. But on the long run, Africa no longer plays the role it used to play at independence. At independence, Francophone Africa was seen as a kind of, how would you say in English? I'm trying to find my words, you know, a kind of backup for the French power in the world, you know. And you could not conceive France as a mid power in the world, especially during the Cold War between the superpowers, you know, with special relationship with the Arabic world, without so-called Black Africa, you know, Sub-Saharan Africa, without the former colonies. It's no longer like this. Macron is young. He was born after the years of independence, like me, and this is his story, you know. So the way French people in power in the government now in Paris conceive the world and the challenge of the global world is very different from the one of Charles de Gaulle in 1960, you know. And Africa, I'm sorry to say so, but doesn't play the same key role, or let's say Francophone Africa doesn't play the same key role as it used to play in the 1960s. For the better and the worst, you know. For the better, because it also means that Africans are becoming more independent because France play less interest. The times when France was intervening to put in power a government or topple one is finished. When Bazoum was imprisoned by Tiani in Niger, France did not, they could have organized an aerial, you know, support. They still did it in 2008 with Idriss Déby, they demanded Idriss Déby, and the French Air Force intervened very near the presidential barrack in N'Djamena. But when it comes to Bazoum in Niamey, they did not do it. So these times are gone, you know. This is part of history. For the better or the worse. I don't know. It's up to you to tell me.
I don't know, because it does seem, to be honest, it does seem that whilst you know you as a scholar and you would know better, but it does seem like, you know, the popular opinion out there is, you know, which I think again a majority of the people in Africa, you know, are being, like Riley said, the elites are exploiting this thing for their own, you know, capture of state resources. But one thing I was going to end on that note, but I can't end without asking this. One thing that a lot of people ask is, why is this former French colonies economy, you know, their currency and their, you know, money stored in French, if that is the case? So I wanted to, I don't know if you can touch on that.
I know it's an issue of sovereignty for many former French colonies. I wish they would get their own currency. Yesterday, I was talking to a French economist, and he was explaining how the French CFA, as we call it, is costing money to the French government because they have to support it against inflation. And frankly speaking, there are many people in French stakeholders when it comes to the economics who would be happy to get rid of the French CFA. But many Francophone African presidents, officially they tell you, we are against this former colonial currency, but are happy with it because unlike the Naira in Nigeria, for instance, you have an equivalence, you can convert the money, it's a convertible currency. You can get access to Euro market. And it's very convenient in this regard, but it means that the French central bank has to support the French CFA, and it costs money. So from a political or even economical point of view, as a selfish French citizen, I would be happy to get rid of the French CFA. And if some African nationalists want to get their own currency, let them get the Naira or the Cedi with all the troubles that go with it. And that would be the end of another specificity of the relationship between France and its former colonies, for the better or the worst, again, and you will tell me.
No, I really, to be honest, Marc-Antoine, I really enjoyed this deep insight because sometimes you can if you're not very careful, you can get carried away with the populist narratives out there.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you need to really look into this kind of incisive discussion. I've really, even I myself, I really learned a lot from this, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers also gain a lot from this conversation. Once again, I'm really grateful for your time. I wish we had seen when you came to London, but I know we'll have another opportunity to catch up
Also,
again.
or in Paris, maybe next time.
Yeah, maybe next time. But once again, I really I'm grateful for your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Take care, and see you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, see you soon. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in to another wonderful episode with my good friend and colleague, Professor Marc-Antoine, who has provided a useful insight into the growing anti-French narrative that has erupted in the Sahel and former French colonies. I hope you enjoyed us, indeed, and I implore you to tune in next time. And for now, enjoy and have a blessed week ahead.